When Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser died in September 1970, 5 million people poured into Cairo to mourn him with uncontrolled grief. For years, Nasser had dominated Arab efforts to remove Israel from Middle East politics, but his prestige had not been matched by his achievements. He had fought and lost 2 wars against Israel. At the time of his death, the region's politics were more dangerously balanced than ever before, so the choice of his successor was crucially important. Egypt's new leader, Anwar al-Sadat, was a less colorful figure, but he was to leave an even deeper imprint on the course of events. For over 3 years, Israel had occupied Sinai and confronted Egypt across the Suez Canal. Entrenched behind the bunkers of the Bar-Lev line, the Israelis felt able to ignore the United Nations resolution which called on them to withdraw. It was a no-war, no-peace situation. Egypt refused to negotiate until Israel withdrew, and Israel refused to withdraw without guarantees of its future security. Sporadic artillery duels across the canal made Egyptian towns like Suez and Ismailia uninhabitable. On Israel's northern frontier, the Golan Heights, there was a similar confrontation with another determined enemy, Syria. Eventually, the superpowers stepped in. August 1970 brought agreement on American proposals for a truce during which a permanent peace could be negotiated. Endorsed by the Soviet Union, the plan was named after American Secretary of State William Rogers. It established 2 important precedents: recognition by Egypt and Jordan of Israel's right to exist and survive, and an apparent Israeli acceptance of eventual withdrawal from most of their 1967 conquests. Among the disputed areas were Jordan's West Bank, including Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, the enclave between Israel and the sea. Gaza's tightly packed population included Arab nomads and Palestinian farmers who had been forced off their pastures by the expansion of Israeli settlements. Israeli-owned industries had sprung up to exploit a workforce which was a good deal cheaper than Jewish labor. 40,000 traveled daily into Israel to work. In Gaza itself, many Palestinians had been resettled to improve Israeli security, but important as Gaza was, it did not lie at the heart of the Arab-Israeli dispute. Jerusalem did. Having unified the city by force of arms, the Israelis were determined to keep what they had won. For many Jews, there was a special significance in regaining control of the holy city after 2,000 years, and Israeli archaeologists had lost no time in setting up their own researches. In Israeli eyes, the intervening centuries away from the land of Judah did not invalidate their modern claim to it. On the other hand, the Palestinians, who stood to lose every inch of their former homeland if Israel stayed in Gaza and the West Bank, were determined to resist from bases in neighboring Jordan. But their behavior had already gotten them into trouble with King Hussein. In September 1970, Hussein acted. For a week, his army and Palestinian guerrillas fought for control of Amman. Peace was finally restored on condition the guerrillas left Jordan. As the dead were buried, it became clear how close the world had come to disaster. Fearing a Soviet intervention, the United States had partly mobilized for a global war. Fortunately, Russia was in no mood for a confrontation. But the crisis was enough to persuade America to give way to Israeli demands for sophisticated arms, especially Phantom fighter bombers. Meanwhile, President Sadat and President Podgorny of the Soviet Union were signing a friendship agreement backed with promises of arms for Egypt. Despite a souring of Egypt's relationship with Russia in 1972, Moscow gave Egypt superiority over Israel in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. And the jewel of Egypt's new defense system was a range of Soviet anti-aircraft SAM missiles. In 1973, with the Rogers Plan dead, Sadat launched a dramatic new initiative. On the afternoon of October 6th, the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and broke through the Israeli defense line in 3 places. This is an Egyptian reconstruction of that offensive. The Egyptian SAMs now came into their own, inflicting huge losses against Israeli jets. Israel's Air Force, its most effective strike weapon in previous wars against Egypt, was effectively neutralized. For the first time in 25 years of conflict with Arabs, the Israelis tasted defeat. Supremely confident of their military talent, they were clearly surprised when Egypt crossed the canal with 2 armored and 2 infantry divisions in a matter of hours. A week after the invasion, the Egyptians had mopped up the last pockets of resistance on the canal and destroyed the Bar-Lev line. Meanwhile, on the Golan Heights, the Israelis were also fighting a desperate rearguard action against Syria. Here, too, the Israelis took heavy punishment from the terrible Stalin organs, powerful Soviet rocket launchers with a huge range. Israeli jets struck back at Damascus, attacking artillery and SAM missile sites. Equipment losses were staggering. In 10 days, Syria lost 90 combat aircraft, Egypt 85, and Israel 80. Russia started airlifting replacements to the Arabs, which in 3 days totaled 4,000 tons. America gave Israel similar help. It took the Israelis 3 days after Yom Kippur to reach full mobilization. It was clear they were facing altogether different enemies from those of the '67 war, better led and with far higher morale. Israel decided to concentrate on the more immediate threat to its frontiers on the Golan Heights and launched the main counterattack against the Syrians. After a week, the Syrians had been forced back to within 20 miles of Damascus. Behind them, they left the wrecks of 800 tanks. The stage was now set for the crucial battle of the war, as Israel turned to face an Egyptian army of over 500 tanks and 100,000 men in Sinai. When it ended, the Israelis had crossed the Suez Canal in the south, and both armies were encamped on each other's sides of the waterway. Meanwhile, both Russia and America seemed suddenly appalled at where the reflex rearming of their clients might take them. As the fighting raged, a Soviet delegation arrived in Cairo for talks with President Sadat. And a few days later, the new American Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, flew to Tel Aviv via Moscow for a meeting with the Israeli government. In emergency session, the Security Council endorsed a Russian-American resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire to be supervised by the United Nations. But already the Arabs had produced a weapon few thought they would ever use, OPEC, the Organization of Oil-Producing States, announced that oil production would be cut by 5% every month until Israel withdrew behind its 1967 borders. It was no sudden inspiration. President Sadat and Saudi Arabia's King Faisal had arranged the move a month before the war had begun. The effect was dramatic. All over Europe, rigid economies had to be made. Worst affected was Holland, which together with America had been singled out by OPEC as especially pro-Israeli. Not only motor traffic suffered, but industry and public utilities too. With a shock, the industrial nations realized just how vulnerable their dependence on oil had made them. President Sadat was the hero of the Arab world, acclaimed at an Arab summit meeting in Algiers 2 months after the war. Sadat's personal triumph seemed to spell fresh hope for the Palestinians. PLO leader Yasser Arafat got full backing for the principles of Israeli withdrawal from occupied Arab lands and restoration of full national rights for Palestinians. Arafat's star continued to rise. A year later, he was invited to address the UN's General Assembly on the Palestine question. "I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun," he declared. "Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." Arafat wasn't the only one carrying an olive branch. The war and the oil embargo had provoked intense diplomatic activity. The first phase of this ended at kilometer 101 on the Suez to Cairo road. Here, a flimsy ceasefire agreement was signed by Israeli and Egyptian commanders. The man who made it happen was America's Henry Kissinger, and after repeated visits to President Assad in Damascus, he also arranged a ceasefire between Syria and Israel on the Golan Heights. In June 1974, the first United Nations soldiers moved in between the opposing forces on the heights. It was a slow road to peace. Kissinger called it step-by-step diplomacy, by which he meant he was aiming at an overall settlement by taking the problems one at a time. One result of his efforts was a revolution in relations between Egypt and the United States. The new friendship was sealed by President Nixon's visit to Egypt in mid-1974. President Nixon arrived with a promise of $250 million in aid for Egypt's ailing economy, including the possibility of an American nuclear reactor. For the time being, the United States balked at supplying arms, but that didn't affect the enthusiasm of Cairo's crowds who received both presidents as heroes. Later the same month, Nixon was to visit Moscow, but his trip produced no common superpower policy for the Middle East. So America continued to occupy the vacuum, and for a while, Henry Kissinger became almost part of the Middle East scenery. Sadat acknowledged his role when he said, "In this game, 99% of the cards are in American hands." The new Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, conceded further reductions in Israeli forces in Sinai, and the Egyptians began the task of clearing the Suez Canal for the first time in over 7 years. It was no easy spring clean. Dredged up from the bottom were 120 tanks and aircraft, a small mountain of live ammunition, and no fewer than 750,000 landmines. By June 1975, all was ready for the ceremonial reopening. Egypt looked forward to $450 million a year in tolls, but the United Nations calculated the Suez closure had cost the world $15 billion. 3 months later, Israel returned 1,000 square miles of the Sinai Desert. American manned listening posts were later set up in the Mitla and Gidi passes to prevent any possible surprise attacks. The Abu Rudeis oil fields, which had supplied over half Israel's oil needs, were also handed back to Egypt. But the changes in Sinai did nothing for the Palestinians. Their hostility remained, and many now began to accuse Egypt of opting out of the Arab struggle. The fighting in Jordan in 1970 had sent 250,000 Palestinians fleeing into Lebanon, and it was from Lebanon that most of the Palestinian guerrillas now operated. King Hussein had feared them as a state within a state, and they were no more welcome here. But the Palestinians had a cause to fight for, an enemy to defeat, and their power in Lebanon grew. Most Palestinians had settled in the south, where many villages served as guerrilla training camps. From these camps, the guerrillas launched raids into Israel. In the Israeli reprisals that usually followed, many local Lebanese lost their lives or homes. It made no friends for the Palestinians. There were also camps in Beirut itself, like Tel al-Zatar, and it was in Beirut that fighting began between Palestinians and Lebanese Christians. When left-wing Muslims joined in against the Christians, Lebanon was soon in the grip of a full-scale civil war. In the next 2 years, over 50,000 were killed in the ferocious fighting. Beirut's prosperous business districts and shopping centers were reduced to rubble, its international hotels wrecked. Damage in the first 9 months alone was estimated at $5 billion. Tel al-Zatar was pounded by Christian guns for 52 days. 2,000 bodies were dug from the ruins. Overall, though, the Palestinian and leftist forces seemed to be winning. Then, in June 1976, Syria claimed the role of peacemaker and sent in tanks and infantry. The Syrians had long supported the Palestinians, but this time they opposed them to save the Christians from being wiped out. In October, several Arab states sent a mixed peacekeeping force, but this too was dominated by Syria. The real tragedy of the war was the polarization of two communities that had coexisted peacefully. Behind an uneasy truce, Lebanon remained politically unstable and dangerously divided. Meanwhile, from across Lebanon's southern border, Israeli artillery began supporting sporadic Christian attacks on Muslim villages. The Israelis were already in force on the frontier, guarding against guerrilla attacks. In March '78, Palestinians made their first raid inside Israel in 3 years. A group landed on the coast in dinghies and hijacked a bus near Tel Aviv. During a shootout with police, the bus exploded and more than 30 died, most of them Israelis. When the expected Israeli response came, it was on a completely unexpected scale. A massive invasion aimed at the guerrilla bases in southern Lebanon. The new Israeli premier, Menachem Begin, called it cutting off the right arm of iniquity. According to some estimates, 10 Lebanese civilians died for every Palestinian guerrilla killed. It took 25,000 Israeli troops to clear about 5,000 Palestinians from the area. Lebanese War gave Israel its only Middle Eastern ally. Lebanon's Christians shared Israel's determination to expel the Palestinians. On their behalf, Israel bombed the port of Tyre and in 1978 launched commando raids on Palestinian villages in Lebanon. The Christians were now taking arms openly from Israel. As a result, they'd lost all the support Syria had ever given them, and skirmishes with the Syrian peacekeepers grew. As always, it was the ordinary people who suffered as their homes became the battleground of outside forces. Again, a United Nations peacekeeping force moved in, but it seemed no one could really solve the problem of the restless and unhappy Palestinians, ironically comparable to the biblical Jews in their years of wandering. The most sensational attempt to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict came in 1977 when President Sadat offered to speak direct to the Israeli parliament. It was an offer Israel quickly accepted. Despite the boldness of the gesture, the actual occasion was not marked on either side by any major change of policy. It did, however, have the effect of restarting the peace talks. Sadat returned home to a rapturous welcome. For the long-suffering Egyptians, his practical approach seemed to promise more than all of President Nasser's dreams of pan-Arab glory. A year later, President Carter brought Sadat and Begin together at his Camp David retreat. The result was an agreement to sign a formal peace treaty within 3 months. Camp David was hailed as a diplomatic breakthrough. But almost before the congratulations were over, the cracks in the agreement were beginning to show. Both leaders met strong opposition to their deal. Inside Israel, Premier Begin was accused of sacrificing national security, so bloodily earned in 30 years of military conflict. And outside Egypt, Arabs accused Sadat of betraying the Palestinian cause. So the 3-month period for signing the treaty came and went. The stalemate was broken by President Carter himself, who risked his political reputation on peace missions to Egypt and Israel. The personal visits showed how important the Middle East had become in American foreign policy. The treaty President Carter hammered out was signed with great ceremony on the White House lawn. It ended the long war between Israel and Egypt and promised the return of Egypt's occupied territory. But the treaty did not solve the Palestinian problem, and again the Arab world condemned it totally. For the Palestinians, Israel's true intentions were shown in the continued Jewish settlement of the West Bank. Israel, they claimed, would not scrap these settlements and would never meet Palestinian demands. America, Egypt, and Israel insisted their pact was only a foundation for the future peace of the Middle East. Begin and Sadat had given each other that promise. But on both sides, there were critics who, in this respect at least, did not share their faith. And within Israel, there were people who demanded Jewish occupation of all biblical lands. As the decade ended, these religious zealots seemed heedless of what the Arabs had been saying for years, that Israel could have peace or territory, but it could not have both.